Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome. We are quite a cozy little crowd, and welcome to everyone online as well. So, yeah, this is dialogue. We engage hearts and minds with the relevance of Christ socially, spiritually, and culturally. And this is one of those spaces that we try to create to hear people, to see that Christianity isn't this thing that's separated from all of life. And so it is such a privilege to have Michelle here this evening. I really think she has the credentials and the background to speak on this topic. Just quickly, they are working for the embassy, the US Embassy, and they are now moving to Israel. So, yeah, so all the best with that and for you and your family. Just quickly, I think all of you have read just a short description on Michelle. I think we would have had her earlier if we just asked her to talk about CrossFit. She's a CrossFit enthusiast, but she really has this gift of, and she's seen so much. She's been all over the world, and I think that really gives perspective. That's a good mirror even for us as South Africans. Mother of three. You'll see their children here, so yeah, supporting your mother. That's beautiful. She's got a master's in international studies, intercultural studies. She has a master's in religion and philosophy, LLB, and she's currently pursuing international arbitration, if I'm correct. Yeah, so there's a lot going on, and I think specifically with these spheres of law and theology and philosophy all coming together, that makes me so excited for this evening. So, Michelle, thank you for right before, I know you guys are packing, and right before heading out, that you make the time to come and speak to us. We so look forward to hearing you. Okay, going to hand over to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Gior, for that very generous introduction. Thank you, Thorsten, and just Dialogue community for allowing me this privilege of sharing on this topic that is actually really close to my heart as well. So today, oh yeah, we need that clicker. One moment. So while we're getting the clicker, this topic, far from the madding crowd, private autonomy and the public square, is one that's actually really close to my heart. And it's interesting because I studied this for my laws dissertation in jurisprudence, and what's interesting is that even trying to figure out how to sneak all businesses crumble. And so I really wanted to look into what was happening. So let's move on. So what we're going to do tonight is, I cannot promise you that we're going to come away with answers. I cannot promise you that. I can promise you that we will examine what is happening. I can promise you a Christian reflection at the end. I can also promise you I will not talk about CrossFit at all. Okay, but if you want to talk about it afterwards, we can chat over in the side. All right, let's get started. So as I want to open with a question for you guys, just to think about what you think the greatest threat to a liberal democracy is. And when I say liberal democracy, because political terms can be funny, I want to say that I mean a society where there is both the preservation of individual freedom along with conflicting, competing conceptions of morality, and more often than not, irreconcilable worldviews. So we're talking about a society where I can do what I want to do and you can do what you want to do, but we do not share the same idea of what is good. So let's think about that. So what do you think the greatest threat is? So by a show of hands, I'm going to show two pictures. I'm going to show the first one. And let me see if this is what comes to mind. Who thinks any of these people and their ideologies is the greatest threat to liberal democracy? Okay, we got one, we got two. Okay, all right. Top left. Second one, who thinks the crowd is the greatest threat to liberal democracy? Ah! I'm sorry, it was tricky. All right, well, I'm going to say that actually it is currently and in the past, and even some of the earliest reformers and advocates of a liberal democracy as we know it today, all knew that the crowd was the greatest threat to a democracy. In fact, it would be Gustave Le Bon, who's a French social psychologist. He published the study. He published a book called The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. And it really inspired some of the greatest masters of the crowd, Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. And actually, I have a copy of that book in case anybody wants, has any ambitions of being a dictator in the future. But most importantly, like the pioneers of liberal democracy knew that over a century and a half ago, that the greatest threat to any society would be the power of the masses. In his monumental work on liberty, called On Liberty, John Stuart Mill, who was a very big pro-democracy enthusiast, and also wrote a lot about what a liberal democracy should be, said that the greatest threat to individual liberty is not the political and legal powers of the state, but the subtle and insidious powers of the masses. So this evening, we will examine, number one, the current threat of crowd pressures, what it is, and how it impacts individual liberty in the modern democracy. We will also review what has been the most popular and widely used solution of many liberal democracies to try to balance that, the rights of the individual and the masses. And thirdly, I will offer a humble Christian response and reflection about how the Christian can move forward with this and how the Christian can exist as well in this climate. All right, so let's get started, all right? Let's talk about this idea of social pressure, also called earlier in the 19th century social tyranny. Ultimately, what it is that it occurs when society itself, outside of the political functions of any centralized state power, act in concert to control the actions and beliefs and morality of the individuals in that society. So basically, the thing that is the biggest threat about this is that the potential for individual suppression has far more power than even in a centralized state power, simply because it leaves fewer means of escape. It penetrates much more deeply into the details of daily life, enslaving the soul to itself. That was the words of Mill. I wish I could write that beautifully, but I had to take his words. But more importantly, if it's society, if there is punishment and sanctions and control at the hands of society, then the punishments can go. There's no limit to where they can go because it's outside of state control. It's outside of laws. And today, the media adds another layer to the invasiveness and control of the crowd, or how the crowd can control. The mob doesn't need to be outside the house. The mob can be right in your living room. There's no space. There's no space that it cannot reach. So let me put some flesh to this philosophy, because this is getting heady. But we can see this in several examples. I've chosen 3. Public spectacle lynching. This is the widespread use of lynching in the American South in the late 19th and early 20th century. Lynchings were unlawful killings used in order to perpetuate racial violence and socially punish crimes in a very, very public and humiliating way. The perpetrators were able to commit such crimes outside of the law's reach as it involved the whole community, the judgment of the community itself. So the community itself would enact judgment against the individuals who threatened their safety or who were perceived as dangerous to their society. Now, lynchings were rarely prosecuted and perpetrators rarely identified because it was justified in the societies that it occurred. So in the lynch mob could be your judge, your lawyer, your police. It could make up everybody. It went outside of the law's power. Now, some might say, isn't it more important to be concerned with extending the law to protect those who would be victims of lynching? And that would make sense, and it is important to lobby in all of that. That is very important. It can't be. But you cannot overlook the crowd and its influence in a modern liberal democracy simply because it is the will of the people. So therefore, the prevailing opinions of the masses in a liberal democracy can often are and will be cemented and crystallized into actual public law. So it fuels it. And this is an example of that. War on terror. In the U.S., there was extensive counterterrorism legislation following the attacks of 9/11. The Cato Institute looked into and reported on it and noted that prevailing public fear fueled a war on terror, which included enhanced sentencing and suspension of due process of suspected individuals, including American citizens of Muslim faith, in order to preemptively fight terror. So outside of the course of law, outside of the courts, even outside of the country in some places, it was justified to skip all of the procedural rules in order to, it was fueled by fear primarily. The Cato Institute would ultimately conclude that to the degree that the public remains terrorized, it seems likely to continue demanding that its leaders pay due deference to its insecurities. This is actually where public fear turned into extended legislation. So that is one example. There are many. I'm going to give one more example. All right, the third example is the war on drugs, which occurred a decade earlier than the war on terror. And this is where inner city Black American males were targeted and subjected to extensive sentencing solely based on social commentators and policymakers who believe that these particular dangerous individuals are uniquely and incapable of being rehabilitated, of changing. And therefore, they shouldn't get short-term sentences. They should be incarcerated for lengthier periods of time than the crime was due. So once again, a place where public fears and the crowds can have it turn into law. All right, now I've said a lot about crowds, but I know somebody is skeptical about hyper-individualism, as we like to say. A lot of times when we talk about individual and freedom, you're thinking that someone is from Texas and they're about their guns. I gotta have my guns and I gotta do all these things. And it's interesting because the gun issue is a sub-principle of overall this idea of individual freedom. But that's another topic. But many of the American left, and I can also, and some of the left as it is used in the West in that particular context, often identify individualism with self-interest and then self-interest with selfishness. And economically, oftentimes we see this in economics, and that is also another discussion. I'm gonna stick to the social element today, the legal element today. But nowhere in the original intention of the earliest advocates do they contend for an individualism that leads to complete self-interest and indifference regarding the rest of society. And we will go into more detail about this later. But it was actually to protect the lower classes from the whims and the powerful influences of the elites and aristocrats of society that were leading the day with their social opinions. And anybody who has watched an episode of Bridgerton on Netflix can see what that means, what that can look like. But also the freedom of the individual, to which Mill and other 19th century reformers refers, is a freedom not to just go and it's a freedom not just like I'm going to do whatever I want. It's really the freedom to seek out and decide what is good for yourself, and not merely parrot societal and cultural mandates. Thirdly, what Mill is not advocating for is this Disney-generated mantra, just follow your heart at all costs. Mill's vision of us and others, their sphere of individual liberty, is one that is held in tension with the individual's obligations and duties for society. So I'm going to qualify individualism here on that point. Now, let's go back. We've had a lot of things happening, so I'm going to bring us all back and talk about where we have gone and where we're going. So far, we've established that crowds and public opinion fuel social, political, and the legal elements of society, both formally and also informally. We have also talked about individualism and how liberal democracies are characterized by the preservation of the individual's freedom, okay? So then, it must follow then, and it has to follow, the individual acting in their own free will and autonomy have formed a crowd. So now we've made a full-on circle back. So we have a problem, and this problem is called the social pressure puzzle. And it basically means that these crowds form because of the cumulative impact of individuals exercising their freedom to pressure those who do not conform to their own beliefs without coordinating their actions or even intending to apply pressure to others. Individuals can nevertheless contribute to the power of public opinion as they pursue their own good. So as we see, it is a necessary element of democracy as well. But, so then how does one balance then the right of the individuals versus the masses, especially when there are certainly, as we all can agree, legitimate social pressures? Public outrage over the moral evils of ethnic cleansing, domestic violence, incest, child slavery, or Ponzi schemes have often been the catalyst to create laws that seek to discourage this kind of behavior, and that will create extremely unstable and dangerous conditions for everybody else in society. So essentially, social pressure provides society with both negative but also positive impact. So how can we know when the interference is legitimate, especially when it is subjective? And I use the example of my husband, Ernest, believing it to be legitimate social interference when I open kimchi and eat it in the house, because the smell is displeasing to everyone, really in the entire house. It travels very far. But it's such pleasure to me. And we're married. Am I supposed to give up eating kimchi forever? So that's just an example, but there must then be some principle. It needs a principle to measure whether the private conduct of an individual is enough to warrant public intervention. And this is where the harm principle, John Stuart Mill came up with the harm principle to do this. And it's been used all throughout the 19th century. In development in 1889, and I'm sure that you are all familiar with it in some way. The actions of individuals should be limited only to prevent harm to other individuals. So when I speak of the harm principle, I mean that these actions should be limited only when it's going to harm another. Now, we see that this is how it works. We see the photo of the scale. So you're actually balancing it. So what you're looking at is my individual act so outrageous that it should warrant public interference? And if so, then it's legitimate. If not, then it's not. So it's a general guideline, it's not a hard rule. And it's easy to see where this is in terms of the obvious cases. For instance, if I allow my dog to go out without a leash, as it might harm another person. So that might be, I might need to prevent, my freedom could be curved to help other people and young people from, and protect them from my dog. Also in the case of murder, that seems to be obvious. If if I'm angry at Lindy and I want to kill her, my freedom, the desire to murder her should be curbed. However, what about those less obvious cases? Is it harmful for an individual to just merely collect Nazi memorabilia and perhaps display it on the window of their house, or perhaps wear a shirt that has a Nazi sign on it? Is that harmful? Is that harmful to others around him, or is it just him or her wearing it? Also, what if someone actually consents to being harmed or killed, as in the case of assisted dying or assisted suicide, or even in a very interesting English case where a man put out an ad in a cannibal fetish site that he was looking for people to be killed and eaten. And he did kill and ate the man, and then said he shouldn't be guilty because of consent. Okay, so this is, you can ask me about that afterwards. I'll give you the case about that. The other one, and this was this issue was really a big issue, was in the English courts of R.V. Brown, where 5 men were found guilty of extreme sadomasochistic activities over a 10-year period, but all consented. It's bodily harm that they enjoyed in their own way, but the house, so it hasn't harmed anybody else outside of them. So then the question is that considered harmful to the public? The House of Lords, in a very debated decision, actually, and they're still talking about it now, said that it was not in the public interest that people should try and cause each other bodily harm for no good reason. So at that point, the right of those individuals to participate in the activities they participated in, the public interest was more important, and then their freedom should be covered. So with all these scenarios, we see how the harm principle operates. And it's not so much, as I said, a hard rule, but a scale, it's a guideline. Then, however, with the current atmosphere of a very, very controlling crowd at new levels, globalized levels, what has happened? The harm principle is not as effective as it was, and it almost does not, it does not work in what we now would see as a modern liberal democracy. It's not effective. Now, there are several reasons for this, there's copies of a bibliography for people that want to read around this issue. But right now, I'm going to talk about 2 of the most major issues, major obstacles to why the harm principle isn't working anymore or applying it. So, okay. The first one is postmodernism. Now, the harm principle essentially is, it acts as an overarching conception of social good. And in the context of modern liberal democracy now, especially now, and in postmodernism, there is no consensus on what is good. Society now is that social interactions are the byproducts of power dynamics, where the privileged few construct systems that not only benefit them, but reinforce their power. However, this power dynamic cannot be directly identified, so the privileged few who benefit from such social arrangements may not have done anything to contribute to its perpetuation. It is beyond them. So this has a radical impact on the relationship and the boundaries between society and the individual, primarily because now individuals obtain their truths not from individual conception or ideas of what is right or wrong, but from shared markers of cultural identity and solidarity and whatever position they are in that society. So it directly impacts now, not only do we not have a consensus of what is good, we also do not have a consensus of what is harmful. And who is saying it might make it more harmful. So I'm gonna explain in an example now. So I think the complexity of this point is best illustrated in the deplatforming or the canceling of Peter Tatchell. Peter Tatchell was a human rights advocate for the LGBTQ community for 30, 40 years. And he's also fought for human rights. Now, he was accused and actually his career destroyed because he was called a racist for his strong criticism against Jamaican rap artists that used to rap songs about murdering and dismembering gay men, as well as he was called a racist because he criticized Robert Mugabe and the harsh and the harsh treatment of the LGBTQ community in Zimbabwe. Now, when Tatchell tried to clear his name and tried to say, hey, I've been fighting for rights for so long, he was told that he was abusing his privileged public position and trying to deflect criticisms against him. So in this case, the severity and the penalty turned not so much on what was said, but who was saying it. And in this case, being a white male impacts the weight is what is said and what is done and limits his freedom. Because of now we have the harm, we're looking at this scale again, right? So if you say something and you're an individual but you are of one status, you might be more harmful to society. So it gets very confusing. So in that case, using harm, and for balancing the scale of intervention now turns on your identity, your status, or your position. So now, like as I said, your race, your class, your orientation could tip the scale of harm and limit your freedom in any way. The second is the word harm itself is the primary issue with the harm principle in the modern liberal democracy. And it's interesting because in the contextual framework of postmodernism, it not only rejects the universal and objective definitions of good, but it also generates radical skepticism of anyone who contends for a shared concept of good, which means there can be no consensus on what is harmful in a society. So if we apply this and understand this now, the people haven't stopped using the harm principle. All they've done is manipulate the word harm to control subjects and limit an individual's action. And given that merely existing can be considered harmful, we will have a harm free-for-all. So what postmodernism does is set the stage for a symphony of harms in addition to the overuse and abuse of harms in order to suppress the individual. So the best example of this is in a case, a landmark case, Windsor v. U.S. You might have heard about it. It was the case that added same-sex marriage in the definition of marriage. Okay, this case, the case in itself was just challenging the legality of denying federal benefits to same-sex couples. In order to do that, they'd have to put a same-sex couple in the category of marriage. So this would define same-sex marriage. But it was interesting in this case because the use of harm was used on both sides. So Justice Samuel Alito, a more conservative judge, stated that redefining marriage posed non-trivial harms to the family structure, which would in turn have far-reaching consequences in the future of society and will be harmful for the American family and so forth. Now, what was interesting here is that those that were for the same-sex marriage being defined as marriage, legally defined as marriage, stated that supporters of, meaning those who want to exclude same-sex marriage from the federal benefits, They acted maliciously with the purpose to disparage and to injure same-sex couples. It says the motivation for the Defense of Marriage Act, this is the act that says marriage between a man and a woman, was to demean, to impose an equality, to impose a stigma, to deny people equal dignity, and to brand gay people as unworthy, and to humiliate their children's emphasis added. So in effect, the liberal response to the conservative argument of harm was to double up the harm and just ratchet it up 5 times, and which incidentally it succeeded. So now the harm principle is no longer a limiter of social pressure. It is instead, in the words of a great legal scholar, Bernard Harcourt, it's a harm free for all, in which the victor is usually the one who makes the most compelling and popular claim of injury, which paradoxically may lead precisely to the kind of mass appeals that Mill tried to rein in the first place, the person who made the harm principle. So in this way, harm is no longer a balance of individual freedom versus the crowd. It is now a source of currency to buy power politically. So we have seen the problem of social coercion in liberal democracies, and we have also explored the current solution and its current inadequacy to protect individual freedom. So why does this concern Christians, and why at all? And I think it deeply does, and I'm going to give 4 points for it. The first one is it concerns us because it allows us to see, it concerns us as to how we love and serve our neighbor, and to see what's actually happening by holding certain views. So as the shift in Windsor has highlighted, holding a belief is directly linked to devaluing the worth of a person. We are no longer merely appealing to the individual, but to a group identity. The individual's worth and purpose of existence is connected to a group. Thus, if one individual still considers that just holding the belief of the traditional definition of marriage as true, is not just holding a different belief, is striking against in their perspective, is striking against the very moral worth and humanity of that individual and everyone else in that group. Secondly, when we as Christians address and engage social justice and issues, any kind of justice issues, cultural issues, which is important for us to do, very much so, we must not allow ourselves to be blinded by pursuing the evils that are just merely popular. Because it is popular at the moment to fight against the rich and privileged classes, and it is unpopular to fight against abortion or the right to die, if that's what you want to fight for. And to view these as secondary issues, when in reality, if your thoughts and individual feelings about abortion, whether it's legal or not, or assisted dying, is not merely something that is not secondary, because it actually defines the legal definition of when someone is alive, and also the legal definition of when someone is considered dead. So these are big issues here, and they're unpopular. So that's third, stifling individuals from developing their inner consciousness and beliefs not only limits public discourse, but it robs the human race of necessary progress. If the most spiritual, intellectual, and creative minds within society are socially pressured into keeping their ideals and thoughts, doubts, whatever it is, to themselves, the impact will be felt profoundly by society. The importance of freedom of moral autonomy is not just for the individual alone. Individual liberty contributes to the development of civilization, for without it, progress would be impossible. Fourth, and this is very important, and this is probably the most important point that I'm going to make tonight, is that the idea that each and every human being, from the king, the queen, to the slave, possesses the power and will to seek good and pursue it, is distinctly Christian. Human dignity as derived from the Judeo-Christian concept of Imago Dei is the principle that every human being should have dignity and also has moral capacity to seek out what is good and to pursue it, not merely to parrot social and cultural mandates. This Imago Dei is described by English theologian Os Guinness as the foundational freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and belief that reflects and promotes and protects the dignity and worth of each and every human being. Society also consists of many individuals, each one warranting special moral regard and equality. And the dignity of that individual is much more than their race, their sexual orientation, their gender, their religion, their class. Each individual may identify with various combinations of group and thus bring a uniquely individualized, necessary perspective to the public square. So ultimately, it is really the Christian response of Imago Dei that can serve to protect an individual freedom in a beautiful way. In closing, nearly 2 centuries ago, Alexis de Tocqueville warned that the kind of absolute power that would arise in the context of a Western democracy would be unique, very much unlike those tyrants and traditional political suppression regimes in the past. This unique social despotism would be more extensive and milder, and it would degrade men without tormenting them. De Tocqueville could not identify exactly what this tyrannical threat would be called. He only knew that it would cover the surface of society with an expansive and intrusive uniform set of rules through which the most original minds and most vigorous souls could not clear a way to surpass the crowd. If this sounds familiar, then it should, and we should be concerned. But it's also an opportunity for the Christian teaching of the sacredness and the dignity of each individual to shine so brightly in the context of societies today. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Michelle. I think what challenges is, or at least me, is it's all of life. Like we are already, you're an individual, but there's crowds, and it almost feels like you're helpless. You're just kind of part of the sea of where society is heading. And you're almost also unfamiliar with what power you have or what we should do. So maybe from a law stance, is there any work that you think is being done to kind of make sure that this harm principle is, what's next? Like, well, how are we going to try and balance this? Or are we just kind of subject to the crowds?
I promised I had no answers for real, but
CrossFit.
It's interesting. I would say that, and Ernie and I have talked about this because Ernie, all of us feel this immense pressure, like definitely back in the States. But you almost know exactly when someone is a Christian because of their grace for other people, and that they actually listen to both sides and are not jumping. I mean, so I think actively let me think about what you're saying. Ooh, it's tough. At this point, I think I see people needing safe spaces who aren't Christian, just all types of people, feeling like they need to be seen as more than just whatever it is. I do kind of see an undercurrent of that coming up. And even if they secretly tell you things like, somebody's like, well, hey, I don't want to come out conservative because I'm gay, but can I say this here? So creating these, these are, actually somebody said that to me actually. So, so these kinds of things, creating these safe spaces that people can see it. I mean, I feel like at some point, our faith isn't necessarily in the world changing or democracy being better. you know what I'm saying? But more so in like trying to be that light, just trying to be that safe space, that sort of judgment-free zone, that listening. I hate that I said safe space, but it's the only thing I could think of.
Is there any questions? Richard, I think I see a hand. Yeah.
Don't ask me for the answers.
Or comments?
Thanks a lot, Michelle. The question I've got is just are we feeling overwhelmed as a generation, or is this something like people would have had a similar conversation in the 40s or in the 20s or even in the late 1800s, or in the late 18th, early 19th century when the lynchings were happening, that people feel the same pressure? Oh, I can't speak about this because the undercurrent of the crowd is pushing me forward. Or is this uniquely us generation? Is it just coming to a head because we're suddenly super connected and you can have a mob of individuals from every country in the world? All of a sudden it's a massive group of people out on your front lawn or on your phone. Is it the technology that's fueling this, or is it, how unique is it?
I don't think it's unique at all. I think, like, I look at that, you know, you see these crowds, you see, and actually it's always troubled me. I went back to actually study about this. So that's how I found Gustave Le Bon. And I mean, it even goes even further back from like to probably like even to reading about Cicero and how he manipulated the crowd. I mean, we can go back so far. I've been very afraid that how like so many groups of people can just go and participate in such horrific acts. And so, and it's like, they're just like, they have to be just like us, and they're just kind of going with it. And so going that far back, and even to Queen Elizabeth, to King Henry VIII's advisor, Thomas Cromwell, all these guys, they all knew what to do, and they used to, even the Borgias, like, this is what gave me actually had me starting to think that, oh, this is what's happening now, reading about what happened back then. And it was, and of course, it's really, so no, I don't think, to answer your question, I don't want to like get too excited because I really like historical fiction. Yeah, oh yeah, the crucifixion. Oh, that's nice. I should have added that in there. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So you're moving to Israel. If this is your topic, and
not necessarily going to pursue.
well, no, I'm just saying, it's like, how do you, it's like, this is the mob harm. How do you protect your family? Aren't you feeling harm, or it's like, how do you justify that decision, or it's like, or you just throwing yourself into the den? I mean, So this is your topic. I mean, for me, the most recent form of this harm principle, right, is as a white man, not necessarily Christian, but to have an opinion on just this issue. Right? Okay, I can't have an opinion. It doesn't matter which side it goes. It doesn't really matter. Right? But you are also moving to a place where you would be judged just for your move, irrespective. But you're moving to a place where when you said it, I judged you immediately.
Why? You judged her how?
Because the modern principle is you moving there, I'm judging you immediately. Because that is what society expects of us currently for moving to Israel. You should not be associated. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's my.
Israel is doing the wrong thing at the moment, according to.
That's my
individual
mob
rights.
Right.
Consciously,
But they're not becoming Israeli.
This is the allure.
sometimes I say, we're moving to Israel, Palestine, having no problem saying that at all. And that's really helpful.
But in this context,
But I'm very big about individual autonomy, so I will listen to you, what you say.
Michelle, I'm wondering, maybe it's a step back, but just a thought there that that to live is to it immediately puts you in a dangerous position. To be an adult is to be in a dangerous position. To make any call for your family is a judgment position, and that's so for any person. So if you're LGBTQ pro. And you say to people, you must allow sin, that's a judgment call. So they're called to say, don't judge us, but it's just changing the perimeters. And so I think as a person, in our dignity and in our autonomy, our moral autonomy, and we are called to make judgment calls. Maybe looking at Genesis, go and rule over the world. Even if you try to disqualify yourself, it's impossible. And so the question isn't, okay, is it dangerous? The question is, who will be the moral exemplars to try and step into that space of dignity?
And I just want to clarify, when you say like individual freedom, I